Hello, my name's Arif Ahmed and I teach philosophy at the University of Cambridge. Today I'll be talking about George Berkeley, who was an Irish philosopher who lived from 1685 to 1753. Berkeley's principal works were The New Theory of Vision, The Principles of Human Knowledge, and Three Dialogues. And I'll be focusing in what I say today really on the latter two. The power of Berkeley's philosophy really arises from two things. One of them is that he presents really plausible arguments that seem irresistible at first reading, for a conclusion that seems totally mad. So that you end up reading his works and thinking, well, maybe he's right, that actually, as he thinks, there is nothing outside the mind. We are all just, belong to God's dream of the reality, and everything there is either an image in my mind or a part of God's dream. It seems crazy, but actually it's very hard to see where Berkeley went wrong. The other thing that's valuable, I think, about Berkeley's work is that he writes with a kind of brilliance and lucidity and economy that's never been surpassed in English-speaking philosophy. So with many philosophers, I'm afraid you do find that there's a lot of wasted space, there's a lot of rhetorical stuff, there's a lot of stuff that really doesn't add to the argument. There's none of that with Berkeley. He writes with exemplary economy as well as power. In this very short course, I'll be talking about three things. First, I'll say a little bit about the mechanical view of the world that Berkeley inherited and the basic distinction that Locke based upon it, which is between primary and secondary qualities. Then I'll be saying something about Berkeley's attack on that distinction. And then finally, I'll talk about Berkeley's further moves against the very notion of matter itself and the alternative, which is Berkeley's view that everything is somehow a part of your mind or my mind or God's mind. First, I'll be talking about Locke's view of the world, which is really the view of the world according to the scientific revolution that took place in England and then in Europe in the 17th century. That revolution presented a view of the world which in many respects is like the one that we have today. And essentially on that view of the world, everything is really just bits of matter bumping into each other. That's all that ever happens in the history of the world. So you and I and trees and tables and sheep and stars and the sun and planets and everything are really just bits of matter bumping into each other. And everything that happens either is or arises from bits of matter bumping into each other. So for instance, when you see something, what really happens is that particles of light strike the thing. The light then gets scattered into your eye, and then electrical events take place in your brain, and that's the physical process that leads to your perception of an object. Similarly, when you think about smelling or hearing or tasting something, and indeed all other interactions, not just the ones that involve our sensing of the external world. If God had looked at a world like this, he wouldn't see any colours or hear any sounds or see any tastes. The world as it is in reality is really a soundless, colourless, tasteless machine, a gigantic machine. And we are just cogs in that gigantic machine, as is everything else. Now, that picture was expressed by Locke in part in terms of a very crucial distinction in his philosophy. And this is what he called the primary-secondary quality distinction. It's a distinction between properties of objects or qualities of objects that he called primary and qualities of objects that he called secondary. Now, the primary qualities of an object are the physically basic properties of it. So if you think about an apple, for instance, what are the properties of it that really are there independently of you and me and how we interact with it? Well, for instance, there's its shape and its mass and its number. These are all primary physical qualities of it. It wouldn't matter whether you or I existed or how we perceived the apple, it would still have the same shape, the same volume, the same mass, it would still be one apple. So these are all primary qualities of the object itself. But besides these qualities, and these were the qualities that entered into the mechanical view of the world, there are also secondary qualities, as Locke called them. And these qualities are ones that an object has because of the way it interacts with you or me. So think about the colour of the apple, for instance. The apple's green, but that's only because it looks green to everyone, or pretty much everyone. And the reason it looks green to most of us is itself to be explained in terms of the interaction of light with our retinas. So what happens on the mechanical view of the world, as I just suggested, was that particles of light reflect off the apple because the surface of the apple is a certain shape. Light of a certain type, that is particles of a certain type, frequency as we would now say, are reflected into our eyes, and our retinas respond to that with certain electrical signals, and that's why it looks green to us. But notice that my explanation of why it looked green, I didn't mention that it was green. All I mentioned were the primary qualities of the apple. So the secondary qualities of something, like its colour, are really nothing in the object themselves except the power to produce certain sensations in you and me, and indeed all observers. And it's only because you and I agree in general on these sensations that we think that the object really has those properties, though it doesn't in reality. If, for instance, to take the apple again, half of us saw it as green and half of us saw it as blue, there wouldn't then be an answer to whether it was really green or blue. The fact is just it would appear one way to some of us and appear another way to the rest of us. God wouldn't see it as one colour or the other. Contrast that with a matter of the mass of the apple. It doesn't matter how heavy it feels to you or to me. The mass of the apple, or the weight of it, is the same independently of how it feels to you or how it feels to me. So those properties which are part of an object, so to speak, objectively and independently of human consciousness and ways of perceiving it, are the primary ones. And those features, it turns out, which are not part of the fundamental description of the universe, but are just features of the way in which we perceive parts of the universe, those are what Locke called the secondary qualities. The distinction became very influential. It was influential not only upon Berkeley, but upon a whole way of looking at the world that we find even in Kant and Hegel and later philosophers. And indeed, whenever you think that there's a distinction, indeed it's a matter of great interest to philosophy where that distinction lies, but that there's a distinction between the properties of something that are independent of us and the properties that arise because of the way in which we perceive it, and which we perhaps in some sense impose upon it because of our sensory organs, our thoughts, our tastes, our culture, all of those things, then in one way or another you're referring back to this fundamental distinction due to Locke between primary and secondary qualities. Now, Berkeley inherited Locke's view of the world, the mechanical view of the world, as I just described it, and in the first dialogue, he presents an interesting sort of attack on that world, and in particular, an attack on the distinction that I mentioned in Locke between primary and secondary qualities. The first strand of his attack consists in an argument to do with the relationship between heat and pain. So you can imagine, if you like, that there's a red-hot poker and you're touching it. And what Berkeley says is that if you think about the heat of the poker, you might naturally think the heat of the poker is in the poker itself. But just think what happens when you touch it. Okay? When you touch it, if it's hot enough, you'll feel pain. But you won't have two sensations. You won't have a sensation of heat and a sensation of pain. There's just be the one sensation. So obviously you're only perceiving one thing, and the thing you're perceiving, the pain, isn't in the poker. Pokers don't feel pain. The thing you're perceiving, the pain, is in you. So when you perceive the heat of a poker, Berkeley thought, you're perceiving the heat, you're perceiving something which is in your mind. You're not perceiving an independent external property. Now, this argument is interesting because it does lay bare a kind of inconsistency on our own thinking. After all, if you think about now, for instance, the distinction between pain and colour, why do we say, if you consider, let's say, a nettle or an electric fence, that when you touch it, you're feeling pain, but the pain isn't always in the nettle or in the electric fence? But when you feel the shape of something or the colour of something, when you see the colour of it, you're seeing something that is always in the nettle or in the electric fence. We could just as well have said that there are, just like patches of colour, patches of pain in the world around us. And those are just features of the world that we become aware of by feeling pain. So there is a sort of inconsistency in our own thinking about that world, though perhaps Locke could have said, well, actually, I agree, heat is a secondary quality, just like pain, or giving pain, but still things like shape and size are not. But then Berkeley extends his attack to those primary qualities like shape and size. So if you think about the poker perhaps, or a coin as an example that he uses, the shape that that object appears to have, and by this Berkeley would have meant the visual shape that it looks to have, just like with colours, varies from the one observer to another. So just as the colour that something appears to have varies according to the way your eyes are working, so too the shape that something appears to have is going to vary according to the angle from which you're looking at it. In both cases, it's features of the perceiver that affect the apparent property that we're perceiving. So that if you look at a coin from directly onwards, it will look round. If you look at it from an angle, it will look elliptical or perhaps even flat. Berkeley then extends this argument in similar ways to all the other qualities that Locke regards as primary. And his argument is, therefore, that really we've got no reason to make this sharp distinction of the sort that the mechanical philosophy insisted on making. We don't have to say that reality consists of two kinds of property, the ones that are in our minds, or that depend on our minds, and the ones that don't. Our experience teaches us equally that all of them depend on our minds, because the apparent shape, the visual shape, the tactile shape, the colour, the heat, the pain, all of these properties depend on us as much as on the apparently external objects that we think we're perceiving. Now, we've seen how Berkeley attacked Locke's distinction between primary and secondary qualities. But in the dialogues and the principles, he actually conducts many much more fundamental attacks on a much more basic notion, which is, in fact, the idea that stands at the bottom of the whole mechanical view of the world, and that's the idea of matter or material substance. I use the word substance here because if you think about the etymology of that word, substance, it means something like standing under. And in some kind of metaphorical way, I suppose we all do have something of like that picture that somehow, if you take the apple, for instance, there's matter that somehow stands under all of the properties that the apple has. So the shape, the size, the mass of the apple are all somehow had by something standing underneath them all, which is the matter of the apple itself. But now when we try and understand what that literally means, we find ourselves coming short. We've got no model and experience of what it is, that relation between an object and its properties that applies when the object has the properties. What is this having relation between objects and their properties? Well, Berkeley thought that we do have one model for that in our experience. And that's the experience that we have of a mind conceiving or imagining or thinking about or perceiving an image or an idea, as he called it. So it's the relation between the mind and its mental images or mental states, ideas as Berkeley called them, that can be the only thing we ever could have meant when we talked about objects having properties. And therefore Berkeley's view turned out to be that the only substance there is, the only thing we can understand by substance, is mind or mental substance. And it's in that sense that he thought that everything is in the mind. Or at least everything is in your mind and my mind and other people's minds. So he thought that there were minds, and those minds had ideas, and that's all there is in reality. The apple, for instance, doesn't consist of some matter that somehow and in some way we can't understand has the properties of being round and hard and weighing a certain amount. No, rather there's you and me looking at the apple, and we have ideas, for instance, visual ideas, or if we touch it, tactile ideas of the apple. But there isn't a further thing which is the apple that has those properties. It's just you and me that we have the ideas that we entertain, perceive, imagine, and so on. Or rather, not just you and me, according to Berkeley, but in fact God. So for Berkeley, the world that we perceive, the world of our ideas, doesn't go out of existence when we shut our eyes or fall asleep. Because those ideas are always and constantly being entertained one way or the other by God himself. And so we are literally living in God's dream, according to Berkeley. It is in God, as the Bible says, that we live and move and have our being. And it was in this way that Berkeley managed to reconcile what he thought was valuable and sustainable from the scientific view of the world with a spiritual view of the world that obviously was much more ancient and in some ways more appealing. Now you might ask what the world would look like, according to Berkeley, if there were no God. And that would be a world where reality, in a sense, gave out if we didn't think about observers or if we weren't observing it. Something like that picture we do find, strange to say, in the quantum mechanical view of the universe, or rather on some interpretations of it. So there are some ways of thinking about quantum mechanical experiments. If you think about, for instance, the EPR result, or the two-slit experiment, if you know it, or the wave-particle duality, according to which reality only means anything, it only is there, if there's an observer who's interacting with it. So the world according to Berkeley, or at least the atheistic world according to Berkeley, isn't that far from the world according to our most modern scientific image, at least on some interpretations of the latter. Having said that, I wouldn't want to make a case for Berkeley simply on, or even mainly on, any contemporary relevance that he might have. I think what's most important about Berkeley and most valuable about his work that you can get is by working through the arguments, which, as I said, are presented in a truly brilliant way, and trying to understand what about them is plausible and what about them is unconvincing, and ultimately what there is in Locke's view that we can preserve in spite of the apparent plausibility of Berkeley's arguments.